Thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. I'm sure there were so many things for you to be doing, whatever one does in Vermont. Um, I've been looking for like maple trees and everything, and that's what I want to do right now. I guess they're just not on the street corners. Like, you just don't walk around with like bottles and like digging at them and like getting maple syrup. I've noticed like how like everything, like every cafe that I go to is like a maple syrup flavored something that shouldn't be flavored with maple syrup. That's wonderful. Thank you all for having me here and for welcoming me into this space. It's so funny that like I get to like walk around and to travel around and talk about love, because for so many years I was just really not into love. You know, it's not that I didn't like love, it's just that like I had this experience of love that was actually quite painful, you know? And that sounds weird. You know, it sounds like a little weird. Well, oh, you've been hurt by love. But actually, I think when we think about it, like some of our toughest experience maybe has come within relationships where someone has said that they loved us, you know? And out of that expression of love, there's been some kind of violence, you know? Sometimes we've been the recipient of that violence, but sometimes we've actually been the perpetrator of that violence. And it's really hard for us to sit with. You know, often it's hard for us to understand that like we too sometimes are perpetrators in the suffering of others, you know. Sometimes we do it consciously, but often, quite frankly, we do it unconsciously, you know, because we lack a kind of a mindfulness, but more precisely, we lack an awareness of how our speech, our actions, and our thoughts are actually impacting the spaces around us. We even lack that awareness of how those things impact ourselves. You know? So thinking about this reality that I kind of like roam around the country talking about love, it's really hard for me to like actually believe that. I've experienced a transformation around love. You know? And I want to communicate that in ways that aren't cliche. So I don't want to sound like a love song, you know, which we all know the words to, you know. And like once you practice for a certain number of years with these practices around love, some of these love songs are really painful to listen to. You know, like I'll die if I'm not with you, or you know these lyrics, and you're like, you know what, this is too much. It's actually too much, you know, but that's where we used to be. You know, it's like teenagers wrote all of these songs that like are so part of like our culture now. But that's how I was informed around love in my early years. And I did grow up in church. I grew up in a Christian community, the Methodist Church, and I learned so much about love from the life of Christ. But, you know, there was always a disconnect. It was always a really stark disconnect. And though I was often hearing about love, no one could tell me what love was. You know, so I had no definitions of love. So if you would have asked me as a teenager, oh, like Rod, what is love? I would have no idea how to answer that. I would quote a song. I would probably quote like a Whitney Houston song. When I really started getting into activism, and this was in my teens, you know, late teens, I really started understanding what it meant to have the responsibility and the obligation to work for the benefit of others, to somehow figure out what my talents were, what I was passionate about, and try to enter into direct change work in communities. And then as I got into my 20s and had certain experiences around coming out in various identities that I occupy, that being queer, also being much more deeply involved in my identity as a Black person, I, you know, was really kind of deepening this commitment to how I was developing a sensitivity to how communities were struggling, the communities that I identified with. But there was no love in that. At least I didn't think so. I moved to Boston after I graduated undergrad back in Georgia, and I moved into a Catholic worker community. Is anyone familiar with the Catholic worker community? This is Vermont, you should be. Dorothy Day, the radical anarchist socialist convert to Catholicism, which is a lot to say in one sentence. And she was credited as being kind of a co-founder of the Catholic worker movement. This was during the Depression in New York City. It was this kind of radical way of being in community with all people, not just people who were experiencing homelessness, experiencing hunger, but also people who were experiencing privilege. And she, with the help of others, crafted this kind of way of being that was modeled deeply on the life of Christ, And so communities began to spring up. I moved into a community that was inspired by the Catholic worker movement. So I came into this community and really fell in love with Dorothy Day. Like, what was it about this woman that made her convert to Catholicism? Not knowing that I was on the verge of converting to Buddhism. What moves someone to engage in this path and to give up everything? So I became really interested in studying her life as I lived in the community. So I was also in that community surrounded by Buddhists. Like many of us, we're interested in listening, to things concerning Buddhism, or we're listening or reading things by the Dalai Lama, or we love the Dalai Lama, and he's this nice old man. That's really a lot of our association with Buddhism, and that was mine. And to back a little bit, the community's role was to challenge systems of oppression and violence. So we did that through various acts of service and through various acts of activism. So we were feeding people, clothing people, but we were also on the streets disrupting things. And this was early 2000s for me, and that deepened my commitment to social change. It wasn't a lot of love in that, at least from my end. I was doing it because I was pissed off. I was pissed off and I wanted to disrupt something, because that's what you do in your early 20s. You have a lot of extra energy, and you're pissed and you have a college degree. So all of that. So what else do you do? Apparently, you're not working, trying to make money. So everything was this complete intellectualizing, And so you take that you take all these lofty ideas about social change out into the street. And so what I began to see after a period of time was a kind of depletion, a kind of running down. People would come to me and they would say, "Oh, Rod, you're really pissed off. You should do something about that anger." And I was like, "Forget you. You don't know what anger is. I'm not your angry." I had a defense, until, after a while I got to this place where I actually felt physically, mentally worn out, tired, super frustrated to a point that I couldn't actually help myself any longer. I was going to activism meetings, I was going to demonstrations, and just really avoiding and dreading going to be in these spaces. And anytime I found myself in spaces where there was a lot of anger, I felt that in my body in a way that I never had before, and it made me afraid. I was afraid because I felt like I was somehow getting out of control. I couldn't stop the anger anymore. I could usually distract myself, do something, take a pill, whatever, but I couldn't do that any longer. So the anger was actually taking over my experience. That introduced me to this really real reality of severe depression. And clinical depression, actually, to such a point I couldn't get out of bed. So I was actually not able to leave my room. And I literally remember that time as being completely black and white. As I reflect on it, it was just in tones of gray. And that was what my experiences was turning into. I felt like I was caving in on myself. So when I communicated this experience to people, everyone was like, "Oh, there's depression, so you should go and get antidepressants. You should go and explore this." And I said to myself, and another voice said to me, "You know what? I think there's something else out there. There's another solution. You should go and find that solution." So I just spent, a little bit of time, maybe a month, a little over a month, meeting with people. Literally, like there are so many spiritual beings around me that I just would go and sit and have tea or dinner with them, and I would just ask them what their lives were like. You know, why are you so different? Why are you avoiding this? You know, and these were also, some of them were activists, not all of them, but some of them were activists. And some of them honestly were like, well, you know, I think you're trying too hard. You're like, there's no way out of this. Like, there's really no other option than to go and seek medication, so you should do that. You know, again, a gut feeling, something in my mind, something was like, no, keep going, keep going. And then I eventually found my way to the home of now this is going to sound really like cliche, but I found my way to the home of a psychic healer. And no, I didn't call her an 1-800 number on TV. It was a woman who actually lived in my neighborhood at the time, and a friend introduced me, and I went over. And was at that moment where this woman, who actually was like my first teacher, was like, you know, I think there are ways to work with this. You know, there are many ways that I can help you, you know, but you have to help yourself. You know, I was like, no, it's not what I'm coming to you for. I'm actually, you should just like fix me, you know. She was like, haha, you should go and start meditating. And so for the first time in my life, I started taking meditation seriously. Not because I loved it, because I didn't have a choice anymore. And it was something that was like, you know, it started becoming as natural as breathing. Like, who loves to breathe? Like, do you sit around like writing love poems about breathing? No. So that's my relationship to meditation. It was like, you know what, I don't love this, but you know what, I'm going to do it, and it's going to become a part of my life. And I love it when we don't have options anymore. You know, unfortunately, that's the only way I do anything. You know, it's like, okay, you can do this or you can die. You know, either or, you know. And I'm like, well, is it easier to die? You know. So I was meditating, and the meditation, along with the help of this healer, you know, really helped me to come out of this space, this really dark period. I left activism, like formal activism, and when I came out of depression, or when depression became manageable, I wanted to deepen my meditation. So that led me into going and hanging out with my housemates, my community mates, who were really actively practicing different traditions of Buddhism. So I would go and hang out in their communities, and that's when I realized, oh, I'm like a Buddhist. You know, like I came out again, you know, and like that's the hardest coming out, you know, when you grow up in a Christian family. You can be anything you want, but not Buddhist. Early on in my practice, I started looking at what we were being taught around love, you know, and those are early pieces. And what I was initially taught was that love was the wish for ourselves and others to be happy. And I felt like just that one teaching, that one definition was a pivotal moment for me, because for the first time in my life, I had somewhere to start, you know. And that start just wasn't about, okay, this is love and go love people. No, the practice was, this is love and now start loving yourself, you know. And so I think that's the piece that we are not talking about in our communities. And when that shifts happen, I would go to, you know, my old activism spaces, my old spaces where, you know, we were organizing and so forth. And I would be like, you know what? I hear all this anger, but what about love? And then there would be all this silence in the room. And like, who let you in? Like, I had friends who were like always thinking about the children. So it didn't matter what we were organizing around. They would be like, but what about the children? And then I became the one who was like, what about love? You know, and then of course I stopped being invited to these spaces. But I couldn't articulate more than that at the time. Like, I couldn't say, well, this is what love is what I'm trying to do around love. All I could say was that love was important. And I really wanted people to believe me. Love doesn't feel as powerful as anger. Anger has this quality of seemingly being very energizing, you know. But what anger is a messenger trying to tell us that what it's connected to is a hurt, is a woundedness. So in other words, anger is the bodyguard for our woundedness, you know. So in these spaces, what I began to understand was that we were all just deeply hurt, like we were grieving, you know, but we didn't want to go there. We didn't want to sit with that, and so we stayed within the anger itself, and we wasted our relationship to anger. We wasted our relationship to anger by not listening to it. We were just using it. We were manipulating it to get things done, but it was actually trying to tell us how to actually be even more resilient. You know, it was telling us, no, to look at where I'm coming from. Go sit with that. That's where your strength is going to come from. You know, because once we enter into holding space for the woundedness, our heart opens. You know, and that's where a change happens. That's where the resistance happens. You know, so for me, when I started really working with that in my own practice, I knew that like there was a kind of self-love that was beginning because I had this capacity and this willingness to move through my anger, not to disregard it, not to push it away, not to criticize it, but to actually honor it and to hold it, but also to know that beneath it was the work of holding space for my woundedness and loving it, loving my woundedness. You know, when we start thinking about, or rather when I started thinking about, you know, ways in which we could re-enter into social struggle, you know, I knew that the only way that I could re-enter into the struggle was to re-enter vulnerable. You know, not using my anger as a weapon, not using my anger as a source of power. You know, not thinking that anger was my superhuman ability, you know, but coming from this sense of being hurt, you know, of being wounded and wanting to communicate that I'm only here because I've been hurt, you know, and I don't want to hurt you, you know, but articulating that I am receiving hurt from this other force, this other party, this other group, this institution, the system, what have you, you know? And so that basic question really arose is like, how do I hold this all in balance, you know? So these are the questions that I kind of started getting into, and then I went in, you know, to retreat and really had to deepen my relationship to love itself. Love became the principal practice for me, you know, and love opened up this reality that I was always avoiding, which is the woundedness. You know, it was the woundedness, and you know, often people come to me and they say, you know, listen, Rod, I can't do that. I can't go sit with the woundedness, or I will fall in. I will actually be overwhelmed by whatever that woundedness is. It could be trauma, it could be anxiety, it could be despair, whatever it is. You know, but for me in retreat, what I was actually learning was not actually how to be overwhelmed by it, but actually how to create this tremendous amount of space around it. You know, that I couldn't fall into that woundedness and be overcome by it if I had this incredible amount of space, if I got really big around it. And when I got really big, there was a spaciousness around my hurt, and from that spaciousness, there was a loving that began to emerge, and also there was happiness around that. So I experienced this really interesting thing then. I could be hurt, I could experience the anger, but encompassing the whole thing was this love. You know, that I wanted to be happy, I wanted others to be happy, but I was still sensitive to the woundedness and to the anger, you know? And when I started experiencing that, I knew that I was ready to start moving back into the world, you know, leaving a retreat, finishing a retreat, and coming back into the world trying to benefit beings, trying to benefit my friends, my family, but also trying to benefit all of us who are suffering in these systems of oppression. You know? So that spaciousness is actually where I am reacting from. It's the love within that spaciousness. You know? And then you start thinking about resistance on top of that. Resistance had never been like part of my vocabulary, as a young activist. But right now, resistance is a word that I still actually don't connect to completely. For me, resistance is the kind of aggression around resistance for me. And I guess what I'm wanting to do instead is not resist, but I'm wanting to stand my ground. I'm almost like, okay, I want to draw a line in the sand and say, this is where I'm standing. This is who I am, this is what I am, this is what I represent, and I will not actually be overcome by the hate and by the ignorance that I perceive around me. So love becomes the way in which I stand my ground, because it's about wanting others to be happy. It's about wanting me to be happy. So if I was still reacting from the anger in the work that I was doing in communities, I would actually still be reproducing violence. I think some of us are really like trying to struggle with this question and having this balance. Like, you're angry, you're pissed off, you're enraged, and we say, well, I can't be effective, if I'm not really tuned to this, if I'm not really situated within this anger. At the same time, we have to come to some awareness that really deeply connecting to anger in this way is actually depleting us. And it actually makes it hard for others to be around us. Like it was hard for others in my early 20s to be around me in a way that I had no way of connecting to. People would tell me again that I was angry. I was just so disconnected. People were actually trying to love me. And I couldn't actually, I actually intercepted that love and then threw it back in their face. So there's that particular aspect of love that I began to really tune into as well, which was this reality that the world was always trying to love me. Complete strangers were trying to love me. But because of my distrust in love, because of the ways in which I had been hurt by love, I couldn't trust that. Even to this experience of someone holding the door for you, and you'd be like, why are you holding the door for me? I don't need anyone to hold the door for me. I wonder, how can we just be present to this one act of kindness? I had this experience recently, a couple of months ago. I was walking out a door, and there was a woman behind me. It was an older woman, and I just naturally held the door open for her. So she walks past me, she looks around, looks back at me, and she goes, listen, I usually don't go for this kind of thing. Because it's Cambridge, Massachusetts, so everyone has an opinion. Everyone always has to give feedback about everything. And she was like, I felt like at the beginning she was really angry. She was like, because her whole thing was like, because I'm a woman, you don't need to hold the door for me, blah, blah, blah. And quite honestly, it didn't really matter who you were. Like, this is kind of what I do. You try to hold the door open for anyone. For women, for like really handsome men, it doesn't matter. It's nice to get a thank you. But like, anyway, this woman turned around, I was just holding space. I was like, okay, okay, you're angry. Then she snaps, like instantly, she is like a flip, and she goes, but since you're so handsome, I'll accept this. And I think I'm glad that happened, because that would have destroyed my trust in humanity after that. Well, not really, it wouldn't. I know how I'm used to people in Cambridge, but I think about that, and I think about the ways in which I've been her. before the ways in which I've completely distrusted and criticized people's random acts of kindness. And just said, okay, you're only doing this because you want something or because I'm X, Y, and Z or whatever, And I've had to, because of my practice, my heart has softened around that. And I've been able to go, okay, you may have all these motives, but I wonder if I can just appreciate this, getting this thing in the moment, And that particular experience really tied back to something that was much older for me. As I talked about at the beginning of this afternoon, how love had hurt me. Well, love had hurt me because love had always been deeply conditional for me. And I'm not necessarily saying this was coming from my family, but this is the message that I was getting in other parts of my life, from school, from friends, sometimes from family as well, but not my whole family. It was as if I could only be loved if I made people happy, or if I didn't challenge people, or if I made people comfortable, or I could only be loved if I was a certain way. For many years, that kept me from coming out, as a queer man. I think that keeps many of us from living our true lives, our true selves, because we want to be loved, and somehow we understand that we can't survive without the love from the people that we are most connected to and most related to and with. And that's why I distrusted love, because it was so tiring to perform, to receive love from people. And then I realized that I had a lot of frustration with people. I was angry at people in my life because I was really resenting the fact that I couldn't get love from them in the way where I didn't have to perform, though I had to keep performing this role. And I knew that I was creating boundaries and barriers with these people. So when people started talking about when I started actually connecting to the reality of love and what love really meant, I was like, oh, so this conditional love was actually not love at all. I don't actually know what it was. But that wasn't the experience of love that I deserved. So I was able to go, okay, so this love or whatever I'm getting from the people that I love in return, okay, maybe it's not love, but maybe they're doing the best that they can. Maybe this is the best that they can do. And I wonder if I can meet them halfway. How can I accept what little they were able to offer me, and how could I actually give rise to gratitude for that? And that began to transform my relationships. And then even looking back, with looking at the communities I was a part of as an activist, I was like, oh, looking back, what was really happening is that we were just doing the best that we could. This is what we were taught to do. So it wasn't personal. It wasn't personal about me, but it was personal in relationship to people trying to struggle through their individual experiences around not understanding love, but being overwhelmed and being distracted by the anger and the hurt beneath that anger. So my heart began to open up more because of that basic empathy, that really basic empathy that I am surrounded by people, including myself. I am one of these people who are trying to do the very best that I know how to do, but understanding that we're all creatures of our conditioning, that we have been informed by causes and conditions that sometimes we're not even aware of. That we've been born into social conditioning, we've been born into contexts that have happened to us without our consent. So all these things have happened, and I've been born into these things, and it takes an incredible amount of effort to develop awareness, to understand where the violence is happening and where the hurt is, and that the anger isn't the point, it's the hurt beneath the point, beneath the anger. So all that really began to change, for me. And this is the kind of realizations that I bring back, into the current movement, for social change. You know, like how do I actually move within these spaces in a way in which I am practicing vulnerability, in a way that I am practicing authentic love? You know, how can I value and even celebrate my anger, but not get lost in my anger? You know, how can I be hurt by the world and communicate my hurt by the world in a way that's restorative, you know, and productive and truthful? You know, and who will care if I do that? And will that change anything anyway? You know? So much of my resistance is actually trying to tell the truth about how I feel and about my relationship to love, and that I've been hurt by the world, and I continue to be hurt, you know, but I know the ways in which I have been a part of reproducing violence because of the ways in which I've invested in anger and not love. You know, how do I enter into spaces now with this message, with this understanding, with this simple being? You know. So I kind of like end with more questions than anything, you know, because this is all something that's in process. You know. So we are living lives, and we're living this particular social climate, this political climate, that doesn't come with like easy answers, you know, obviously. You know, so we're having to face this reality that we have to actually change who we are to meet the challenge that's facing us right now. You know, we're trying to use our old selves to meet this new reality. You know? So another question, how do we let go of the person we used to be in order to deal with the present moment and how it's emerging? You know? I think love helps us to do that. I think love helps us to adapt each second, because there's a kind of fluidity, there's a kind of openness that comes with loving, and it responds to the moment. It responds to what's rising right in this second. You know, it helps us to hold the space for what comes up for us. And we say, oh, it's too much. There's too much happening. There's too much going on. You know, I don't think there's too much. I think we're too small. You know, but I think opening up, expanding, getting larger, deepening our love means that we have to actually deal with the things that we habitually avoid about ourselves. You know? And one of the things that I had to like deal with even more recently in the past few months is like, oh, you know what, I am like trying to fight against all of these issues, but these issues are being reproduced in my experience every day. You know, these kinds of ways in which I discriminate and judge, you know, the kinds of dislikes I have for people, the kind of fear that I reproduce over and over again, the ways in which I choose not to do the real work of confronting, instead just bypassing and stepping to the side. You know, these are real experiences that I'm having. I suspect that some of you are having. Some of you aren't, but some of us are. You know, how am I reflecting these systems I'm trying to disrupt? You know, so we're trying to go out and do the organizing and going to the marches and the die-ins and all these fun things that we're doing now. You know, but we can't even have a conversation with the people in our lives. You know, the people that we had an argument with 10 years ago, we can't seem to bring our hearts to reconcile. You know, and it's not about these things that are about like protecting ourselves and like trying to recognize there's been real hurt. Sometimes we are really petty, you know, and we just refuse to recognize that. You know, but it's easier for us to go out and do all these acts than to like call up someone and to apologize. You know, like if you really want to resist, you know, you should go and repair all the relationships in your life that you're actually probably the reason why the relationship crashed to begin with. That's how we recreate connections. That's how we reestablish our integrity. That's what love compels us to do, and love will actually bring us to some really depressing places because it will force us to look. And then we will be challenged with opening our hearts even wider, even deeper. And then we're called to bring this awareness to those around us. Then you have to become the person in the organizing committee, raising your hands, asking what the role of love is in this moment, in this work. And if there's no love in the work, then I would actually leave. So I question what kind of good we can do if there's no love in the space.